As the police unraveled the puzzle piece by piece, a chilling truth began to emerge. Brian's composed demeanor concealed a tempest raging inside him. Whitney's journals, Adam's manipulative schemes, and Brian's abrupt disappearance all pointed to a singular, devastating revelation. The very deceptions that had propped up their marriage had morphed into the driving force behind a shocking betrayal, one that wouldn't just end in sorrow but in sheer catastrophe. Was it love, revenge, or sheer hopelessness that pushed Brian to take his final, irreversible steps? Before we delve deeper into this intense story, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if gripping tales like this capture your interest, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. The Hayes residence was nestled on a peaceful, tree-lined street in Springfield, a picturesque suburban neighborhood where every house looked like it belonged in a high-end real estate ad. Inside their charming two-story home, Brian Hayes moved with the steady efficiency of a man accustomed to maintaining the life he had carefully crafted. An electrician by profession, Brian took pride in his work ethic and reliability, qualities that had earned him a reputation as one of Gulteca's most trusted employees. At 36, he was the epitome of rugged strength, with sandy blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a sturdy build honed through years of demanding physical labor. Yet, behind his confident exterior, Brian harbored a growing sense of unease. Subtle changes in his wife Whitney's behavior had recently planted a nagging doubt in his mind. At 35, Whitney Hayes was everything Brian wasn't: detail-oriented, ambitious, and highly intellectual. As a sociology professor at the local college, she had recently secured a junior faculty position, which came with its own mix of excitement and challenges. Whitney was undeniably captivating, with her long, dark hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. Her disciplined and driven nature had always balanced Brian's more laid-back personality, and for 8 years, their marriage had seemed solid. But lately, Brian had started noticing shifts in Whitney's demeanor. At times, she seemed unusually quiet, her gaze drifting off as if lost in thought. Other times, she was overly accommodating, almost as though she was trying to patch up an unseen rift between them. What troubled him most was her sudden insistence on boundaries, particularly concerning an upcoming seminar she planned to attend in Cincinnati. "That sounds like a great opportunity for you," Brian had said one evening as they stood side by side cleaning up after dinner. "Maybe I should take a couple of days off and join you. We could find some things to do together when you're not busy with the seminar." She froze mid-motion at the sink, her hands pausing over the dishes. "No," she replied quickly, her tone sharper than he expected. Realizing her reaction, she softened her voice. I mean, don't forget we've already planned that spring break cruise. Let's save our time off for that." Brian frowned slightly but chose not to push the matter. "If you're sure," he said. "I just thought it might be nice to spend some time together." "It will be," she said, her voice warmer as she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "But this trip is really important for my career, and things have been so hectic at work. I need to stay focused." Her insistence lingered in his thoughts. Whitney had never been opposed to his company before, why now? As the days rolled by and the seminar drew closer, Brian couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Whitney prepared for her trip with meticulous care, packing days in advance and double-checking every detail of her itinerary. To Brian, it felt like she was preparing for more than just a professional conference. Their once easygoing relationship had begun to feel strained. Although they still shared laughter over old memories and occasionally discussed starting a family, there was now an unspoken tension between them. Brian noticed how Whitney avoided meeting his eyes whenever he asked about her work or mentioned her teaching assistant, Adam Torres, a name she had casually brought up earlier in the semester but now seemed to dodge entirely. The morning Whitney left, she kissed Brian goodbye with the kind of ease that comes from years of routine. Her suitcase was already packed and waiting in the car. "Try to eat something besides pizza while I'm gone," she joked, flashing a forced smile. Brian stood at the door, watching as her car disappeared down the street, the uneasy feeling in his chest settling in deeper. Left alone in the quiet house, his gaze drifted to the cruise tickets pinned to the bulletin board. There was something about the way Whitney had brushed off his offer to join her that didn't sit right. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. But as the day wore on, that sense of discomfort lingered, stretching across their home like a shadow that refused to lift. Brian had noticed the changes in Whitney weeks before her Cincinnati trip, but he chalked it up to stress from her new role at the college. Whitney had always been organized, but lately, her behavior felt different, more frantic. She packed her schedule so tightly that their usual evening chat seemed to fall by the wayside. Her words and actions didn't seem to align. "Don't worry about me," she said one evening, sorting through a stack of seminar papers. "I'm just trying to keep things straight. After this trip, everything will calm down." Brian nodded, but he wasn't convinced. Whitney had never been the type to obsess like this. And her insistence that he stay behind during the seminar raised more questions than answers. When he half-jokingly suggested tagging along, her abrupt refusal hit harder than expected. He tried not to dwell on it, but that gnawing feeling in his chest grew harder to ignore. The day before Whitney was set to leave, Brian arrived home early. The house was unusually quiet except for the low hum of the washing machine downstairs. He found Whitney upstairs, carefully arranging items in her suitcase. She barely glanced his way when he stepped into the room. "Hey," Brian said, leaning against the bedroom doorway. "You're really on top of things this time." Whitney smiled faintly, still avoiding his gaze. "You know how much I hate rushing at the last minute." Her tone was light, but her movements felt stiff, like she was simply going through the motions. Brian lingered, watching as she folded a blouse with slow, deliberate precision. Her fingers hovered over the fabric, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. In that moment, Brian felt oddly out of place in his own home. "Need me to print anything for the drive?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "No, I've got everything handled," she answered quickly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Thanks though, sweetheart." The pause between her response and that affectionate term struck Brian as odd, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. It was subtle, but enough to make the unease inside him twist a little tighter. The following evening, after Whitney had left for Cincinnati, Brian found himself standing in their bedroom, staring at the empty side of the dresser. Her things were gone, but the faint trace of her presence still lingered. Yet the room felt colder without her in it. His eyes drifted to her travel bag resting on the dresser, the same one she'd mentioned forgetting earlier. He reached for it, intending to set it aside neatly in the closet. As he lifted the bag, something caught his attention. Beneath it, half hidden, lay a small red leather journal. Brian's hand hovered over the journal, his fingers grazing the brass lock. Whitney had always been private about her journals. She rarely talked about them and never left them lying around. Finding it out in the open felt like stumbling into a space he wasn't meant to enter. But that lingering sense of doubt wouldn't let him look away. For several long moments, Brian held the journal, his mind wrestling with itself. The lock seemed to gleam under the soft bedroom light, as if daring him to open it. A part of him urged caution, he could just put it back and pretend he never saw it. But the unease that had crept in over the past few weeks refused to let him walk away. He examined the lock more closely, noting how simple it looked. Letting out a breath, he placed the journal back down and wandered into the kitchen. A cold beer seemed like the only thing that could give him a little clarity. By the time he returned, his mind was made up. If Whitney wasn't hiding anything, why would the journal be locked? And why had her behavior shifted so suddenly? The next morning, Brian made his way to a small specialty store downtown, where he picked up an identical red journal, complete with a matching key. It was a costly risk, one Brian felt he had no choice but to take. Back at the house, he slid the new key into the journal's lock and turned it with a soft click. As the cover creaked open to reveal the first page, his heart thudded heavily in his chest, his hands trembling slightly with every flip of the paper. The initial entries felt harmless, even warm, Whitney's excitement over her new position and the delicate balancing act of her growing responsibilities. But as his eyes moved further down the pages, the tone began to shift. One entry stood out like a glaring light in the dark. September 8th. Adam Torres, my new assistant, started today. He's tall, charismatic, and carries himself with an effortless kind of authority. The female students already seem captivated by him. I can't deny he's competent, but I'll have to make sure to keep things strictly professional. Brian's eyes narrowed, rereading the words as his pulse picked up. Adam. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Whitney used to mention him frequently, until she didn't. It had been weeks since Brian last heard that name pass her lips. Another entry followed, equally disquieting. September 24th. I spent most of the afternoon going over readings with Adam. He's sharper than I anticipated. Lately, I've been thinking more about starting a family with Brian, but between work and everything else, it feels hard to focus. Brian's grip tightened around the journal, the pages crinkling beneath his fingers. As he kept reading, Whitney's handwriting grew more frantic, each line slanting sharply across the page as if she had been writing in a hurry. Then he came across something that made his stomach twist into knots. October 10th. During our meeting today, Adam locked the office door. I told him it was inappropriate, but he just laughed, brushing it off like it was a joke. He said no one would notice. I didn't know what to say, so I let it slide. Now I feel conflicted. Brian froze, rereading the words as his jaw clenched. The further he went, the clearer it became, tension hung heavy in Whitney's writing. There were admissions of guilt, but woven beneath them was something else, an unmistakable pull toward Adam. Every entry he uncovered felt like a fresh blow, landing harder than the last. With an abrupt motion, Brian snapped the journal shut, his breathing ragged. He stared down at the brass lock, now dangling open, and tried to steady his thoughts. All the suspicions he'd tried to dismiss had been dragged into the light. Whitney was keeping secrets, ones that threatened to tear apart the life they had built. For the first time since their wedding day, Brian felt like an outsider in his own marriage. His hand drifted toward the second journal in the shoebox. His heart hardened as he pulled it out. He had to know everything, whatever the cost. Brian flipped to the next page, his gut sinking as Whitney's words painted a portrait of a woman teetering between guilt and temptation. At first, the confessions were subtle, small flickers of doubt creeping into her thoughts. But over time, the entries grew louder, more unmistakable. September 30th. Adam smiled at me again during the lecture today. I frowned, hoping to send a message, but he didn't back down. After class, he lingered behind to talk. There's something unsettling about his confidence, like he knows exactly what he's doing. I told him I'm married, but he just smiled and said, I hope. I should have been offended. Instead, I felt uneasy. The slant of Whitney's handwriting seemed to reflect the tension she felt, her normally careful script tilted forward, unsteady. By the time October rolled around, her words carried more weight, as if she were trying to wrestle with emotions she could barely contain. October 16th. I should have told him not to lock the door. When Adam asked why I seemed distant lately, I laughed, but he kept searching my face like he already knew. Then he hugged me, too long, too tight, and I didn't pull away quickly enough. For a fleeting second, I wondered what it might feel like to let go. But the thought left me ashamed. This has to end. Brian sat on the edge of the bed, the journal lying open in his lap, his fists clenched tight by his sides. The words burned in his mind, louder than anything else. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or harmless flirtation. It was something more. And Brian couldn't ignore it anymore. Brian's fists clenched tighter with each word he read, anger rising in tandem with an aching sadness that settled deep in his chest. Whitney wasn't just struggling against Adam's advances, she was fighting a losing battle with her own weakening boundaries. The tone of her journal entries grew darker as Adam's behavior became more brazen. October 20th. He locked the door again today, claiming he needed privacy to discuss something urgent. When I asked him to leave it open, he just smirked and carried on like I hadn't said a word. He leaned against my desk and told me I deserved better than Brian. How would he even know that? I pushed him away, but the way he looked at me, it felt like he was always in control. I hate that part of me didn't completely hate it. Brian's jaw tensed, his teeth grinding as he reread the passage. Adam's casual disregard for Whitney's protests stoked the fire inside him. Her guilt was obvious, but so was Adam's unrelenting manipulation. By November, the pages painted a picture of a woman scrambling to reclaim authority over a situation that had spiraled out of her grasp. November 9th. Adam crossed another line today. I've told him we need space, but he keeps inventing reasons to stay close. I told him this can't happen again, but he just laughed and said it already has. He's right. I can't undo what's happened, but I can end this. After the seminar, it's over. Brian closed the journal slowly, feeling the full weight of Whitney's inner conflict settle on his shoulders. The regret in her words, paired with Adam's persistence, sketched out a story of a relationship teetering dangerously close to destruction. Brian wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the realization that it had been unraveling for months right in front of him. As he sat alone in the dim kitchen, the journal lay open on the table, its contents carved into his memory like scars that wouldn't fade. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, a steady drumbeat counting down the hours he had spent poring over every entry. Anger tightened his chest, but beneath it was something heavier, a hollow ache that clawed at him from the inside. For 8 years, he had trusted Whitney without question. Now, that trust lay in pieces at his feet. His grip on the edge of the table turned his knuckles white. A single thought began to take root and grow: he needed proof. The idea of hiring a private investigator wasn't one he arrived at easily. Brian wrestled with the decision for hours, pacing the living room, phone in hand. Part of him wanted to confront Whitney the second she walked through the door, demand answers, shove the journal in her face, and force the truth out of her. But what if she lied? What if she denied everything? No. He needed something she couldn't deny: cold, hard evidence. After scrolling through endless search results, he came across the name Pearson Investigations. Their tagline read, "Clarity in the shadows." Clarity was exactly what he craved. When Brian finally called, his voice felt tight, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "Pearson Investigations, how can I assist you today?" The voice on the other end was calm and professional. Brian hesitated, swallowing hard as the enormity of what he was about to say sank in. "I need proof of infidelity," he admitted, barely recognizing the strained tone of his own voice. "I think my wife is cheating on me." The receptionist connected him with Francis Hopkins, a seasoned investigator whose measured tone immediately made Brian feel more grounded. "Tell me everything," Hopkins said, leaning into the call with the quiet patience of someone who had heard stories like this before. Brian recounted every detail: his discovery of Whitney's journal, the entries about Adam, and the gnawing doubt that had consumed him since her behavior began to shift. His voice faltered as he described the final passages. Hopkins listened intently, never interrupting. When Brian finished, the detective spoke plainly. "We can set up cameras in her hotel room and the adjoining room," Hopkins explained. "If she's meeting with this man, we'll catch it: photos, videos, whatever you need." "Is that the direction you want to go?" Brian exhaled sharply, the weight in his stomach twisting tighter. "Yes," he murmured, feeling sick even as the words left his mouth. The following afternoon, Hopkins called with an update. "It's done," he said simply. "I have photos. I'll send them now." Brian's laptop was already open on the table when the email arrived. His heart hammered as he clicked the attachment. The first photo showed Whitney entering her hotel room, Adam close behind, his hand resting lightly on her back. In the next, their silhouettes were caught through the narrow crack of the door, the closeness between them undeniable. The last image stole the air from Brian's lungs, Adam leaning in, his lips brushing against Whitney's, their faces inches apart. Brian's vision blurred as tears welled in his eyes, the screen flickering before him like a scene he wished he could erase. But no matter how many times he blinked, the truth stared back at him. Undeniable. Inescapable. But he blinked away the tears, allowing the anger to steal his resolve. Each photo hit like a blow to the gut, ripping apart the foundation of the life he thought he had. For a long while, Brian remained still, the weight of betrayal settling over him like a heavy blanket he couldn't shake off. When he finally moved, it was with intention. He printed every photo, slipping them into a plain envelope he placed squarely on the kitchen counter. He hadn't figured out exactly how he'd confront Whitney, but one thing was certain. The woman he believed in, the one he thought he knew inside and out, no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone he couldn't trust. Brian lingered at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if the photos might somehow change if he stared long enough. His anger no longer burned hot. Instead, it settled into something colder, sharp and calculating. At first, he imagined confronting Whitney outright, demanding explanations, slamming the evidence down for her to see. But the more he envisioned it, the more pointless it felt. Confrontation would lead to denial, excuses, maybe even tears. He wasn't sure he could stomach hearing her twist the truth. No, he needed to play this smart. His first move had to be financial. Brian knew he had to secure what was his before Whitney even suspected what was coming. Early the next morning, he drove to the bank, the parking lot half empty beneath the pale wash of sunrise. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space as he stepped inside, his pulse quickening as he approached the teller. He forced a polite smile, sliding his ID across the counter. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said evenly. The teller, a young woman with an easygoing air, glanced at the screen. "Sure, how much?" "20,000, Brian replied, keeping his voice steady though tension coiled tight in his chest. Her eyebrows flicked up for just a second before she nodded. "I'll need to get a manager's approval for that. Give me a moment." Brian watched her disappear into the back, his fingers tapping lightly on the counter as his gaze swept the lobby. Would this raise flags? Would Whitney somehow catch wind of it? The thought gnawed at him, but he kept his expression neutral. The teller returned alongside the manager, who handed Brian the cash in a discreet white envelope. "Anything else we can do for you today, Mr. Hayes?" the manager asked, his voice professional but curious. Brian shook his head. "No, that's all. I appreciate it." As he stepped back outside, he let out a long breath, gripping the envelope a little too tightly. The cash felt heavier than it should, a physical reminder of how far he'd have to go to untangle himself from the life he once cherished. His next stop was GL Tech, the company he'd called home for 6 years. Brian emptied his locker quietly, each item feeling like another piece of his identity slipping away. He was halfway done when Grant, his supervisor, appeared in the doorway. "Hey, Brian," Grant said, eyeing the pile of tools and gear. "You clearing out?" Brian hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I need some time off. Personal stuff." Grant frowned, concern creasing his face. "You're one of our best guys. Is this permanent?" Brian shrugged, shifting his weight. "I'm not sure yet. Just need a break for now." Grant studied him for a beat but didn't push further. "Take care of yourself," Grant said, shaking Brian's hand. As Brian left the building, he felt the weight of the decision settle over him. His job had been one of the few constants in his life, and now it was another thing slipping through his fingers. Back home, Brian leaned over the kitchen table, staring at a notepad, sketching out his next moves. He couldn't just vanish for a few days, he needed to disappear. For good. His pen scratched across the paper. Cancel phone plan. Find temporary lodging. Sell car, swap plates. His gaze drifted to the cruise tickets still pinned to the bulletin board. The plans he and Whitney had made for the spring break trip now felt laughable. With a rough yank, he tore the tickets down, crumpling them in his fist and tossing them into the trash. The sound of paper crunching echoed through the otherwise silent kitchen. By nightfall, Brian sat alone in the living room, the envelope of photos still sitting untouched on the table. He thought about leaving them there for Whitney to find when she came home, but even that felt too direct, too final. Instead, he tucked them into the drawer, deciding that she could discover the truth after he was long gone. By midnight, Brian had packed a single duffel bag and carried it to his car, loading it into the trunk. As the engine rumbled to life, he pulled out of the driveway without glancing in the rearview mirror. This wasn't just an escape. It was a severing of ties, one that couldn't be undone. It marked the start of something new, free from the weight of betrayal. When Whitney stepped inside, the familiar creak of the front door cut through the heavy stillness, echoing softly through the quiet house. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light spilling from the kitchen. The air felt strange, as if the house had been holding its breath the entire time she was gone. Usually, Brian would be there to meet her, offering a weary smile or pulling her into one of those lingering hugs she once took for granted. But tonight, the silence greeted her instead. Her suitcase thudded softly onto the hardwood floor, and she moved toward the kitchen, the sharp click of her heels punctuating the emptiness. Faint traces of beer and cold pizza hung in the air, clashing with the subtle scent of lavender that usually lingered from the candles she loved to burn. The kitchen table was bare, save for a single piece of paper, neatly pressed beneath the weight of the salt shaker. Her heart sank the moment she recognized Brian's handwriting. Whitney. Grant called this morning needing help at the village center. I agreed to step in as senior foreman. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Bree. The message was short, almost businesslike, void of the warmth she'd come to expect, no trace of the familiar nicknames or inside jokes he often slipped into his notes. Whitney exhaled, a tangled knot of relief and guilt tightening in her chest. Part of her feared Brian might have sensed something after she returned from her trip, but this note suggested otherwise. Still, something about it felt distant. The words carried the weight of something unspoken, a quiet gap between them that neither seemed willing to address. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, reading the note once more, her fingers trembling slightly against the paper. The idea of calling him flickered in her mind, but the thought of hearing his voice, taut with some emotion she wasn't ready to face, stopped her. Instead, she sat quietly, eyes fixed on the salt shaker, as memories of their last conversation swirled. The cruise they planned. The life they built. The lies she carried like stones in her pocket. The silence pressed down on her, thick and suffocating. Pushing the chair back, she stood abruptly, brushing the unease from her thoughts, and headed upstairs to their bedroom. Everything was in its place, but something about the room felt off. Her travel bag rested atop the dresser where she'd left it, and the closet doors hung slightly open. Her gaze flicked instinctively to the journal. It sat untouched, resting right where she had placed it before the trip. Whitney let out a shallow breath, crossing the room to pick it up. Her fingertips traced the smooth leather cover, the familiar texture grounding her for a moment. Unlocking it, she flipped through the pages, stopping at the last entry, the one she remembered too well. After this trip, it's over. I'll focus on Brian. On us. The words stared back at her, heavy and unforgiving, like an accusation she couldn't ignore. Whitney closed the journal slowly, her reflection catching her eye in the mirror. She studied herself, taking in the tired, worn expression etched into her face. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she'd done. Guilt, which had simmered quietly beneath the surface, now clawed its way to the forefront, loud and relentless. Her fingers curled around the edge of the dresser, nails digging in just slightly. "I can fix this," she whispered to the empty room, her voice shaking but determined. The note from Brian was folded carefully and placed on the bedside table. She promised herself, tomorrow, she would talk to him. Tomorrow, she would lay it all out. There was still time to mend what had been broken. Whitney sat on the bed, staring into the dim corners of the room, her resolve solidifying with each slow breath. The sharp knock on the front door jolted her back to reality. Her half-empty cup of coffee rattled against the bedside table as she set it down, the sound echoing in the stillness. Her eyes flicked to the clock, barely 8 a.m. Through the bedroom window, she glimpsed the outline of a police cruiser parked in the driveway, its lights dark but unmistakable. A chill crept over her skin. What were the police doing here? Pulling her robe tightly around herself, she made her way downstairs, heart thudding against her ribs. When she opened the door, two men stood on the porch, one in a dark suit, the other in uniform. Neither smiled. The older man, tall with streaks of gray through his hair, lifted a badge for her to see. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice steady but not unkind. Whitney nodded, the hesitation clear in her eyes. "Yes, that's me. I'm Detective Valdez, and this is Officer Santos. Would you mind if we came in for a moment?" Her heart pounded louder in her chest. "Is something wrong?" Valdez's gaze softened just slightly, though the professional edge in his demeanor never wavered. "We need to discuss Adam Torres. May we?" Whitney stepped aside, forcing a nod as she led them to the kitchen. The house felt colder with them inside, as if their presence had drawn all the warmth from the air. At the kitchen table, Valdez settled into the chair across from her while Santos hovered near the counter. Whitney gripped her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles paled. Valdez wasted no time. "I'm sorry to inform you, Mrs. Hayes, but Adam Torres was found dead last night. His body was discovered at his home around 7 p.m. Whitney froze, the words crashing into her with brutal force. "Adam, dead?" Her thoughts spun wildly, tangling into knots she couldn't unravel. How did he die?" she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Valdez's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched her. "That's what we're trying to piece together. What we do know is that someone made a call to report the murder. That call came from your husband's phone." The weight of the statement nearly knocked the air from her lungs. Her mug rattled as she set it down, trembling. "Brian," she stammered. "That can't be right. He wasn't even there." Officer Santos, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. "The call was traced to Niagara Falls. We also recovered a discarded pistol nearby. The caliber matches the bullets used in the shooting. Witnesses in Adam's neighborhood reported seeing a man fitting your husband's description not long before the estimated time of death." Whitney's head shook violently, disbelief spilling out with her words. "No. Brian wouldn't do this. He didn't even know Adam like that." Valdez leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His tone remained calm, but it carried the weight of something unshakable. "Mrs. Hayes, are you certain about that?" He paused, letting the question linger. "We found photographs near Mr. Torres's body. They were of you and Adam. They appeared recent." Whitney's breath caught in her throat. Her hands fidgeted in her lap as her face drained of color. The implication hung heavy between them, suffocating in its silence. "No," she repeated softly, clinging to denial like a lifeline. "Brian wouldn't hurt anyone. This has to be a mistake. Maybe someone stole his phone, framed him or something." The detectives exchanged a glance that only deepened the pit in her stomach. Valdez stood, pulling a small card from his coat pocket and placing it on the table. "If anything else comes to mind, don't hesitate to call. And Mrs. Hayes, if Brian reaches out to you, I strongly suggest you let us know immediately." Whitney gave a faint nod as the door closed behind them, leaving the house emptier than before. She sank into the chair, staring blankly at the card, her mind spiraling. For the first time, she questioned just how well she really knew Brian. The mist from Niagara Falls hung low, swirling under the dim glow of the streetlights. By now, the tourists were long gone, leaving behind an unsettling stillness, broken only by the constant thunder of cascading water. It was here, along the edge of the overlook, that officers combed through the remains of Brian Hayes's life. A dead phone, its screen cracked, lay in a trash bin near the lot. Beside it, they found a worn leather wallet, cash missing but ID and credit cards intact. Beneath the plastic liner rested a small, unmarked pistol, the serial number filed clean off. Nearby, discarded license plates sat at the bottom of another bin, their edges roughly torn as if removed in haste. Detective Valdez stood over the scene, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. "He's not jumping," Valdez muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Santos stepped beside him, jotting notes. "Think he's still nearby?" he asked, eyeing the discarded plates. "Or did he just leave these as a distraction?" Valdez rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "If he was going to vanish for good, we wouldn't have found anything. This feels too calculated. My bet, he left this behind to throw us off." The detective let out a slow breath, gazing down at the mist that veiled the falls. Brian Hayes was either long gone, or about to make another move. Back at the Hayes residence, Whitney sat alone at the kitchen table, her eyes resting on the pile of journals she had retrieved from the bedroom. The house creaked faintly, as if whispering secrets she no longer wanted to hear. Her fingers hovered over the red leather covers, the brass locks catching the light from overhead, gleaming like tiny reminders of the secrets they held. With a shaky breath, Whitney unlocked the nearest journal, her heart pounding as she flipped through the pages. The words blurred beneath the veil of her tears, but she pressed on, her eyes tracing the jagged handwriting that filled the final entries. The same haunting phrases repeated themselves, echoing louder each time she read them. "I hate what I've become. Brian deserves better. After this seminar, I'll end it. I'll focus on us." Her hand trembled, the paper rustling faintly as she turned each page. Every word felt like another twist of the knife, cutting deeper into the fragile remains of her heart. Whitney could no longer deny the truth. The unraveling of their marriage hadn't been caused by Adam's relentless pursuit or Brian's growing distance alone. It had been her. Her choices. Her hesitation to draw the line when it mattered most. Her breath hitched as her eyes caught Brian's name scrawled hastily in the corner of the final page. "I love him, but I'm scared. He'll never forgive me if he finds out. How can I face him now?" The journal slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud against the floor. Whitney pressed her hands against her face, her shoulders shaking as sobs broke the heavy silence of the house. Guilt, shame, and unbearable grief poured over her, relentless as the roaring falls. Her mind spun with flashes of memories, the locked doors, the lingering glances, the soft-spoken excuses she had whispered to herself, trying to make sense of her betrayals. "I ruined it." Her voice barely broke the stillness. "I ruined everything." Her reflection in the darkened window stared back at her, a hollow and unrecognizable version of the woman she used to be. In a sudden surge of frustration, Whitney swept the journals from the table, sending them tumbling across the kitchen floor. The sharp echo lingered before fading into the emptiness around her. As the moment stretched on, her anger ebbed, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion. Whitney sank down, pulling one of the journals into her lap and clutching it close to her chest. She stayed there for hours, the weight of her choices pressing down as she stared blankly ahead, unable to will herself to move. Her mind replayed every misstep, every hesitation, every lie she had told herself, each one bringing her to this very moment. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, she forced herself to stand, the heaviness clinging to her like a shadow. With slow, deliberate movements, Whitney gathered the journals and returned them to the dresser, her eyes lingering on the mirror. Her reflection didn't seem as distant this time, but she could still see the cracks. Her voice was faint, barely audible, but the words carried weight. "I'll face whatever comes next. I owe him that." Her steps felt lighter as she made her way to the kitchen, though the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. The phone sat idle on the counter, cold and silent, a lifeline to the husband she might never see again. Whitney hovered over it, hesitant to reach for it. She didn't know if Brian would ever forgive her. She didn't know if she could forgive herself. But she owed it to him to try. Days slipped into weeks as the search for Brian Hayes stretched on, offering little in the way of answers. Niagara Falls remained the last trace of him, both a starting point and a dead end. Surveillance cameras showed his car crossing the border into Ontario, but there was no record of it leaving. Local authorities combed through nearby motels, trails, and roadside parks, but every lead evaporated, leaving nothing behind but frustration. Brian's discarded phone and wallet offered no clues, no trail to follow. Speculation filled the void. Had he walked away willingly, vanishing into obscurity? Or had something darker claimed him in the shadows beyond the falls? Detective Valdez sifted through the evidence for the third time, his gaze lingering on the dead phone resting inside an evidence bag. "A man like Hayes doesn't just disappear," he muttered, shaking his head as if the pieces weren't fitting together the way they should. But with each day that passed, the trail grew colder. Resources dwindled. Eventually, the case faded, just another unresolved mystery among many. Whitney drifted through the house in a haze, her once orderly routines dissolving into hollow motions. The space felt cavernous without Brian, his absence more noticeable in the quietest moments. His laughter. His footsteps on the stairs. The way he'd hum under his breath while fixing something around the house. Now, the house echoed with nothing but memories. The journals remained hidden away, but the words inside haunted her. She could still feel the weight of every confession she had written. She avoided her friends, dodging questions she couldn't bring herself to answer. Even work felt distant, her colleagues' voices drowned out by the relentless hum of guilt pressing down on her. In the silence, Whitney found herself revisiting conversations, moments with Brian she had taken for granted. Every act of kindness, every tender gesture, now felt like another reminder of the man she had betrayed. Brian had always been there, patching up the car, cooking dinner after long days, holding her when she crumbled under stress. And now, when he needed her most, she had let him slip away. But the ways she had let him down lingered, wounds that couldn't be undone. Some nights, Whitney allowed herself to believe Brian was still out there, watching the same fading sunset from some far-off place. Other nights, the fear crept in, the fear that maybe he was gone for good. The uncertainty gnawed at her, a quiet, persistent ache she carried like a weight she knew she deserved. She was left with nothing but silence, regret, and the faint hope that one day Brian might resurface. Even if only to bring the closure neither of them had found. As the months passed, the search for Brian Hayes slowly dissolved into the background, another cold case destined to collect dust. Whitney tried to move forward, returning to her lectures at the college, but the world felt dimmer. Each day seemed to drag a little longer, the passion that once fueled her dulled by the guilt that refused to fade. In the quiet moments, walking to her car, locking the doors at night, Brian's absence felt sharpest. Every unexpected knock sent her heart racing. Every unfamiliar number flashing across her phone made her pulse stutter. But it was never him. One evening, after returning home late from campus, Whitney found herself seated alone at the kitchen table. The house felt larger than ever, its silence echoing around her like a reminder of what had been lost. Her eyes drifted to Brian's chair, the familiar shape of his absence carved into the space where he used to sit. Her gaze shifted toward the drawer, the one where she had hidden the envelope of photographs. They remained there, untouched, buried beneath old bills and forgotten papers. Whitney poured herself a glass of wine and settled into the chair, letting the weight of the empty house press in around her. She had just lifted the glass to her lips when the doorbell rang. The suddenness of it made her freeze. Carefully, she set the glass down and rose, the soft padding of her steps barely making a sound as she approached the door. Her mind wandered to possibilities, maybe a delivery, or a neighbor needing something. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. Only a single envelope lay beneath the porch light. Whitney bent to pick it up, her heart pounding the moment her eyes settled on the handwriting across the front. Brian. Her hands trembled as she tore it open, pulling out a folded letter written in his familiar scrawl. Whitney. I've gone far away, and this is my final decision. I loved you, but the trust is gone, and I can't live with what's happened. Find yourself again. You deserve peace. Goodbye. The letter was brief. Final. Whitney's knees weakened as she leaned against the doorframe, her vision clouding with tears. He wasn't coming back. The note wasn't just a farewell, it was a quiet acknowledgement that their life together had ended long before this moment. Brian had chosen to disappear, leaving behind the shattered pieces of the life they once shared. For the first time since his disappearance, Whitney allowed herself to grieve, not just for Brian, but for the love that had slowly slipped through her fingers. In the days that followed, Whitney set the wheels in motion to sell the house. Staying no longer felt right. The memories within these walls had grown too heavy, and the emptiness whispered louder with each passing day. She tucked the journals away in a storage box, uncertain if she'd ever have the strength to open them again. On the final day, Whitney stood in the doorway, gazing back at the bare rooms one last time. The house, once full of life, now felt like a shell, a ghost of what had been. I'm sorry, she whispered into the quiet, unsure if the words were for Brian or for herself. As she locked the door behind her, Whitney stepped away from the home they had built, carrying the weight of her mistakes but determined to find her way forward. Far from Springfield, Brian stood beneath an open sky, gazing at the horizon as the wind swept past him. The past felt distant now, trailing behind him like the fading embers of a fire that had burned too long. Ahead lay the unknown, vast and uncharted. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. Neither of them knew where life would take them next. But maybe, just maybe, that was the point. In the silence that stretched between them, two souls began their separate journeys toward healing, each step forward leaving behind the shadows of what was, in search of something new.